높은 놈, 배운 놈, 잘난 놈, 있는 놈 모두 다 내 얘기를 들어봐라. 나도 말 좀 해야겠다. 이 높은 데 있을 때 큰 소리 좀 쳐보자.
이거 좀 받았다가.
Welcome in this second part of the retrospective of Korean actor Han Sung-ki. We had already covered in the first part his very early career as a child actor until the middle of the year 1986. It was not the best time of his career. Many films during that time were average at best, but with this second part of this retrospective we are really going to go into the core of his filmography with some of the best film he has ever done and some of the very best film of South Korean cinema history as well. And many of them actually are not that known to the mainstream audience. So that's a good opportunity to show some light on some films which are really worth it. So without further ado, let's dive in. So as I said, we had finished the previous one with a film from the early 1986, Lee Jang-soo baseball team. And we will continue with the same year, 1986, with a film called Hwang Jin Yi, directed by Bae Chang-ho. Hwang Jin Yi, it's the name of a very famous kiseng. Kiseng are the equivalency, the Korean equivalency of the geisha, so some kind of hostess who are there to entertain their clients. And she was a famous figure from the Kiseng during the Joseon dynasty. The Joseon dynasty being the last imperial dynasty of Korea, one of the longest also. And so it's a real historical figure Bae Chang-ho is dealing with. If like me, you don't know anything about Hwang Jin Yi, I learned about her through the film. Unfortunately, I don't think you will really learn that much more by watching the film. The core idea of the character is there, namely that she is a pretty girl, that she's someone with knowledge, with culture, but she's not able to really develop as much as she would like because of the patriarchal neo-Confucianist society, which was really very strong during the time of the Joseon dynasty. So this part is there, but there is really not much more than that, and I think it's a bit unfortunate. We don't really understand more deeply or more intimately the character, and I think that's really the limitation of the film. And one reason behind that is because of its structure. The film is basically different scenes at different time of her life, but there is not much connection between them. You will have one where she's really young, then you will have one where she's when she's a bit older, and so on, and like 3 or 4 time period like this in her life, but with some big gaps between the two, and I feel like it's lacking some kind of connection, and it doesn't really help to develop the character that well, in my opinion, and I think that's the big problem that the film suffers from. And so we remain with a fairly superficial vision of the character. The main ingredients, the main aspects are there indeed, but not much more. And so at the end, it's hard to really completely emphasize with the character, in my opinion, or to really understand it more deeply. Having said that, it's not all bad, because you can feel that Bae Chang-ho has put a lot of care in his direction. He has really tried to have some very aesthetically pleasing framing. He has worked hard to create some kind of atmosphere, to recreate the time period of this Joseon dynasty, and all this is on the screen. So you still have at least a film which is aesthetically quite successful, and which propose a convincing vision of this time of the Korean history. So on that aspect, the film is worth checking. It's just that there was probably something a bit deeper to go in, and Bae Chang-ho unfortunately doesn't go that far. When it comes to Han Sung-ki, he actually has a very small part, almost a supporting part. He plays a small shoemaker who is very interested in Hwang Jin Yi. He spies on her. It's a bit unclear if he's in love with her or if he's just lusting. Anyway, he spies on her, sees her when she's at her most intimate time. And finally, he got caught, and he got punished for that. And that's pretty much it. So only during the very first part of the film that he appears, he is convincing, but he has almost no dialogue there. I think he just say like 2 or 3 lines, and that's pretty much it. So he's convincing, he does a good job, but there is not much you can do or you can say about his performance there. And unfortunately, that's the same kind of conclusion that I draw from this Hwang Jin Yi. We move to the year 1987 with another film by Bae Chang-ho, which is called Our Sweet Days of Youth. Han Sung-ki here is the lead. He is a young student, an engineering student, if I remember correctly, who once again is in love with a girl, a young actress, a theater actress, and he wants, of course, to seduce her, to be with her. But he has a problem. Basically, he's extremely clumsy and immature when it comes to expressing his feelings, and so he has a lot of difficulty to be able to show his love to this girl. It's a romantic comedy, obviously, but not a very successful one, and I think it's mostly because of the way the character of Han Sung-ki is written. As I said, he is extremely immature in his expression of his feelings, and so what we see on the screen is just the flirting of the poor. I mean, it's all about pity. He's trying to show his feelings, but through pitiful acts, and he's mostly getting the pity of the girl and never really any real affection. And it's really cringy, to be honest, to see that, especially as Bae Chang-ho makes it last very long on a movie of about 2 hours. All these cringy flirting comedy moments last easily around 1 hour 30 minutes. So the third, fourth of the film is this kind of very awkward romantic comedy time, and it's really not pleasant. It's extremely frustrating to see this character being such a loser. You really want to give him a slap and tell him, wake up, be a man, and tell her what you think, tell her what you feel, and get over with, because it's really annoying. Being written like this, of course, Han Sung-ki has to play the character this way, and he does, but it's certainly not a pleasant performance from him. I think he does what he has to do, but that's not satisfying either from the character itself, either through his performance. He doesn't really manage to go further than this pity that the character is able to create as an emotion. And so that's really a problem. It's really a big problem and it's especially disappointing from a director like Bae Chang-ho, who was quite good during the early stage of his career. Remember, we already talked about him when he did People from the Slum, Flower on the Equator, Well Hunter, Deep Blue Night. And as you can see already, and all these films I talk about in the first part of the retrospective, and as you can see, while it started quite strong, the more he continues his career, the more his films are getting weaker and weaker. And that's really on display here in Our Sweet Days of Youth. And the fact that he is not able to find the right tempo and the right style for this film is especially distressing, given that he had done a few years ago A Flower on the Equator, who was very clever in being able to play two genres at the same time, being some kind of romantic comedy and at the same time being potentially a psychotic thriller kind of film. And he was able to have these two aspects with a lot of skills. I mean, he was really able to play between the two and never go too deep into one or the other, and that was extremely satisfying. But here he just doesn't manage at all. He just does all the wrong choices, and it's really annoying to see him fail so much there, while a few years ago he had been so successful in doing this kind of mix of genre. And what is especially frustrating is actually the ending, because at some point in the film, Ahn Sung-ki finally managed to get the girl, and then we get a very quick editing of his life as a couple with the girl, and it gets actually more interesting during this last segment of the film, and it concludes in an extremely tragic, dramatic way. And surprisingly, actually, that part gets quite touching. And I was wondering, is it because we have spent so much time with the characters before during the romantic comedy part, so that at the end he finally managed to create some kind of attachment for the viewer? But I don't really think so. I think it's really because he actually put the right mood, the right art in this last part, and he should have done the opposite of what he has done. Instead of having the third fourth of the film being a romantic comedy, a clumsy romantic comedy, he should have had maybe 1/4 and the rest of the film being dedicated to this more tragic aspect or more realistic aspect of what it is to have the life as a couple with a child in Korea during the second half of the 80s, which, as I said, is much more interesting, but as it is very short, we can't really appreciate it fully. So a lot of wrong decisions, I think, when it comes to the script writing, when it comes to the orientation of the story, and at the end, unfortunately, a film which is extremely frustrating. And it's interesting in a way, because you can consider Our Sweet Days of Youth as some kind of ancestor of the classical Korean romantic comedy, so the one who would become extremely popular during the early 2000s. Actually, they even started during the end of the 90s, but they are not necessarily that known. But I was thinking about films like My Sassy Girl, this kind of stuff, which tend to always have a bit the same structure, with the romantic comedy parts during the first half, and then it will evolve into tragedy during the last part. And there is already a bit of this structure in Our Sweet Days of Youth, but handled very badly by Bae Chang-ho, unfortunately, a director who had some talent, had a lot of potential, and made some good film in the early stage of his career, but the more he kept going, unfortunately, the less satisfying his films were. We move to the year 1988 with The Age of Success, directed by Jang Sun-woo. The Age of Success is, in my opinion, one of Ahn Sung-ki's very best films. That's actually the one I used to do the thumbnail of this retrospective, and it's a parody of the corporatist culture which was taking root in Korea at the time. So Ahn Sung-ki in the film is a small executive in an advertising company who has a lot of ambitions, who have a very specific philosophy of life about being successful and having no remorse in order to achieve that result. And so he will apply this philosophy in order to get promoted into the higher echelon of his company, but of course with such a philosophy which has no mercy on people around him, he will get a taste of his own medicine basically at some point. And as I said, it's a parody of a culture which was really becoming prevalent in South Korea at the time. South Korea, through Park Chung-hee's regime during the 60s, 70s, had gone through a tremendous economic miracle, mostly through industry, but it was evolving into a society of service. So basically from blue collar to white collar society. And the Age of Success is really emblematic of this evolution, with new industries, with insurance, with banking, with advertising, all these kind of service industries which were becoming extremely successful and extremely important in South Korea at the time. And Jung Sun-woo is using that backdrop to make fun of this culture, to make fun of the extremely rigid hierarchy they are, on the way they manipulate people, the way they manipulate opinion, the way they don't really care about people around them, these kind of things. And he does it very successfully. It's both very funny and very insightful about the state of South Korean society and work culture as well. And he also makes some direct parallel between this corporatist culture and military, and even so far as Nazism. And that's actually interesting and relevant, and it may be a bit surprising, but there actually have been some historians who have shown that some elements of Nazi culture were indeed used later on into management techniques. So there is some elements which are true there, and it's especially true when it comes to South Korea, or maybe a bit less on the Nazi analogy, but when it comes to the inclusion of military spirit into this kind of company, that was really based on some reality, for the simple reason that the Korean army, the South Korean army, had been the most advanced when it comes to management, when it comes to organization skill, these kind of things, because they were in direct contact with the US Army. Many of their people, many of their officers were sent training over there, and so they were quite accustomed to this kind of thinking, this kind of culture. And when Park Chung-hee became the leader for almost 20 years, he put a lot of these military higher-ups into the civil service, into some important companies as well, and so they were really able to transpose this kind of military management style into this kind of companies. So there is a real situation here described by the film. I mean, it's really based on a reality, and that makes all this reference to militarism when they are preparing for an advertising campaign. You see that there is some kind of patriotic speech. You see them taking some stance which are very typical of the army, these kind of things, and it's both funny, but it's also true to a reality of South Korea at the time, and to some extent still a bit to this day. Jung Sun-woo actually is, in my opinion, a pretty good director. The Age of Success is his second film. He did some interesting stuff like a movie which is not very known called Timeless Bottomless Band Movie, which I already talked about in the Song Congo retrospective. Is mostly known for the very last film he did, which was a huge flop, a huge failure at the box office, Resurrection of the Little Match Girl. But during the 80s, 90s, he was a director with some talent, and who made some pretty interesting films. And of course, Ahn Sung-ki is absolutely brilliant. He's really funny when it should be. He's also very intimidating when it should be. You can see the kind of artless philosophy that he has. He really believes in it. He really shows what is the character from the beginning to the end. So in my opinion, it's one of his very best performances, and a must if you like Ahn Sung-ki, a must anyway if you like South Korean cinema. It's a film which is not that known, unfortunately, being from the 80s. As I already said in another video, it seems most of the Korean cinema fans are stuck in the 2000s for good reasons, but still there are many very good films from the 80s and the 90s, and The Age of Success is certainly one of them. So check it out, especially as it is easy to watch. It's available on the Korean Film Archive YouTube channel, so you really have no excuse not to watch it. In 1988, Ahn Sung-ki is into Chilsu and Mansu, directed by Park Kwang-soo. Chilsu and Mansu is an adaptation of a novel from Taiwan, which was actually banned in South Korea, but which Park Kwang-soo managed to adapt anyway in a film. He just didn't credit the original story because he would not have been able to make the film otherwise. And the fact that he's able to do a film like this also shows that during that time, the second half of the 80s, censorship in South Korea was slowly starting to relax. You have to remember that South Korea had been a military dictator during the 60s, 70s under Park Chung-hee, with a very strict censorship, especially during the 70s, the worst time of South Korean cinema. And during the 80s, there had been a change of power, Park Chung-hee having been killed, and we got some other general who took over Chun Doo-hwan. And unfortunately, he kind of continued in the politic of his former military colleague. But at the same time, there were a lot of protests. There was really a big pressure of society in order to go to democracy, and so Chun Doo-hwan started some actions going in this direction, but at the same time he still used the old dictatorial tools in order to remain in power. And so you had a very tense time during the 80s. And during the first half of the 80s, the censorship was still pretty strong. But in 1987, there had been some very strong protests in South Korea, which Chun Doo-hwan didn't repress the usual way, meaning by sending the military against the crowd. And by this action, the transition to democracy was really confirmed, and so there was a start of relaxation when it comes to expression, and that also expressed itself through a milder censorship. And so we can start to see during that time films which are critical of the regime or critical of this time of the 60s, 70s of Park Chung-hee's rules. And Chilsu and Mansu has a bit of that. So Chilsu and Mansu is about two characters named Chilsu and Mansu. Chilsu is actually the main character. He's a small time artist who is a bit drifting in life, no clear goal, and who spends most of his time trying to flirt with the girl who is working at Burger King. and he will meet Mansu. Mansu is someone a bit more intellectual, but whose father was on the left, from the communist sympathizer, and so because of that he hasn't really been able to do what he wanted in this South Korean society, and so he's just a small-time painter of billboards. And Chilsu is going to be friend with him, and they are going to work together painting billboards. And so during the 2/3 of the film, we mostly follow Chilsu, as I said, flirting with the girl, and so it has a bit of a romantic comedy vibe. Not super comedy, but there is a little bit of that, and it's actually interesting because you have a good idea of what it was to be in South Korea during the second half of the 80s. I think the atmosphere is pretty well shown on screen in Chilsu and Mansu. And then in the last third of the film it gets more dramatic, and in my opinion it gets more interesting. The first part of the film is interesting but more mild, less incisive when it comes to what it wants to say about South Korean society. But the last third, as I said, is much more interesting because you have the two characters who are painting a billboard at the top of a building, and at some point they are really frustrated by their life, by the impossibility for them to really realize themselves in this environment, and so they start screaming at the top of the building to get rid of these frustrations. But people below think that they are going to kill themselves, that they are going to suicide, and so they call the police comes, then the press, and then they find themselves stuck in this situation. They cannot say that it was just nothing, and so they become a kind of a political symbol of the frustration of some younger generation of South Korea, even if they didn't necessarily want to be that. And so it becomes interesting because there is a bit of this kind of black dark humor, but it's also tragic, and it's also a political commentary about the situation of South Korea at the time. So this part is really clever and really smartly done by Park Hwang-soo. The rest of the film, as I said, is lighter. It's also interesting, but a bit less satisfying than this ending. But because of this ending, because of this last third of the film, Chilsu and Mansu ends up being quite a good film and quite a recommendation in my book. We move to the year 1989 with Gagman, directed by Lee Myung-se. Lee Myung-se is a director who has some talent and who made some pretty good film, and Gagman is usually considered as a very important film by the South Korean critic. It's very much appreciated, but in my opinion it's a complete disaster. What is the story of Gagman? It's the story of a small-time actor, entertainer, comedian who is extremely fond of Charlie Chaplin. He basically looks like him. And this small-time comedian wants to make it big. He wants to direct a film, and he's basically stalking and harassing people from the film industry in order to achieve this objective. He's going to manage to get two people on his side in his ambition of becoming a director by convincing them to be his actors, but as he won't really manage to get the support from the industry that he is looking for, he will do it another way, and he will start robbing banks in order to get the money in order to make his film. As I said, I think the film is a complete disaster. And that's mostly because the character of this character of the small entertainer fond of Charlie Chaplin is completely over the top. If you have seen Laughing Times, directed by John Woo, the first film by Cinema City, you are probably already aware of the disaster that was Dean Sheck's performance as Charlie Chaplin. Well, if you watch Gagman, you will see the same, but by Ahn Sung-ki. And so Ahn Sung-ki is this Charlie Chaplin impersonator here, and he's, as I said, completely over the top. He's overdoing everything. He always does weird faces, stuff like this, during the whole film, and it's just plain annoying. It's really unbearable. I don't want to say it, but that's how it is. It's really unbearable when you watch it. And for a movie which is the title Gagman, it's just not funny. It's plain annoying. There is almost nothing funny in the film, and that's a big problem. Once again, for a movie which is called Gagman, it's a real problem not to be funny and just to be cringy and annoying for the most part. You could hope that at some point, when the things are getting a bit more dramatic, basically when they start robbing banks, when they start using weapons in order to threaten people around them, it could move into the tragedy, drama territory with a bit of social and political commentary about South Korea. But even that, it doesn't really work. There is not much bite to it. There is not much really interesting commentary being done about South Korea society back then. And as the characters are so annoying and you are so not, you don't care about them, basically. You don't really believe much in what they are doing, so you don't really have any empathy when they are going through this more dramatic stage of their life, and so at the end it's really a complete disaster, especially given that Lim Young-se ends it with some kind of twist, which is the kind of twist that you would have from a 5 or 6 year old schoolboy when he's doing a composition and he doesn't know how to end it. I mean, that's this level of talent there. Fortunately, Lim Young-se, the director, will do much better later, and we will talk actually about another film he did, which is actually extremely interesting. But Gagman, in my opinion, is a complete failure on every aspect. Maybe the only one who is okay in the film, I think, is the main actress, who is kind of natural. She managed to make her character a bit more believable and a bit more interesting. But even like this, I mean, she's not able to save the film just by her performance. And as I said, it's a film which I really disagree with the Korean critic when they say it's a major film of the 80s. I think it's a complete failure. So of course I cannot recommend you to watch Gagman, but if you are a big fan of Charlie Chaplin's impersonator from Asia, maybe you can have a look. It's actually easy because as it's the case with The Age of Success, it's available on the Korean Film Archive YouTube channel. So go there if you want, but be warned that it's not going to be pretty. Let's move to 1990 with another very important film in Ahn Sung-ki's career, which is North Korean Partisans in South Korea, directed by Jong Chi-young. Korean Partisans in South Korea is actually based on some war memories which had been published in South Korea around 88, if I'm correct. And so made into a film 2 years later. Once again, it's really emblematic of the relaxation of South Korean censorship. Around that time, a film like this would have been impossible to make during the 60s or the 70s, but it's based on a reality which was kind of taboo in South Korea at that time. Mainly that there were some people from the South around the time of the Korean War, and actually even a bit earlier than that, who had gathered, who had taken up arms against the government, trying to support North Korea and have the North Korea dominate and reunify the Korean peninsula. And so that's the case of the main character we are going to follow, who is played by Han Sung-ki, and who is a journalist, a left-oriented journalist, and who is going to join this North Korean militia partisans, South Korean partisans working in the very south of South Korea and fighting against the South Korean government, hoping for the North to succeed in the war. We follow him during the early stage of the war, so during the early middle 1950 until end of 1952, if I remember correctly. And we are going to witness what happens amongst these partisans, the way some romantic relationship will happen between the different members, the way there is this political indoctrination or arguments about different ways of doing the job as a partisans, and what kind of society should happen if they succeed. We will see them fight against the South Korean army. Of course, we will see them do some kind of political work in a South Korean village, sometimes going so far as repressing people who are not their supporters. We will see some abuse as well. So it's a very complex and full, in my opinion, vision of what it was to be such a partisans of North Korea around that time, and it shows them with a human face, which was not necessarily something happening often when it came to the Korean War. The South Korean film industry during the 60s especially had made many films about the Korean War, but usually when it came to the depiction of North Korean, they were always shown as extremely bloodthirsty, without mercy, almost as monsters. But here we have a much more human side to them, which is, in my opinion, realistic about what it was to be in such an organization back then. So we see that they have a real passion, a real idealism behind their action, but we also see at the same time that it leads to some abuse, and that it's also the first roots of a more potentially dictatorial and abusive system. And so all this, I think, is very well described by Jung Ji-young. He really does a very good job in showing these different aspects, and I think it's very important to keep it in mind to have a more complete vision of what was the Korean War, and to understand the trauma that it represented for Korea in general, and that it was not just black and white. There were a lot of nuance of grey as well, and so this film is very successful to show this complexity, and it makes it with a real cinematographic value as well. You have some beautiful landscape of the rough geography of South Korea in the south, a lot of snowy landscape. It's really well framed, well used by Jung Ji-young in order to give a wide scope to his story. And it's very effective also to highlight the harsh conditions that these people had to deal with. There is many different characters who are all well drawn and interesting to follow, especially the one of Han Sung-ki, who is absolutely perfect here. No problem with his performance. He has the right tone throughout, and is a very good choice in order to for you to emphasize with these people while remaining also with a critical mind. There is one scene in the film which I find especially brilliant. It happens when the partisans are in a South Korean village, and they are actually fighting with the South Korean army. Each side is behind a wall, and there is a bit of a field next to a house, and then you have a little girl who comes into the field in order to catch a pet, and then both sides stop shooting to each other in order to avoid hurting the girl, and they start shouting for the girl to come to their side, and the girl is completely lost. She doesn't know to which side she should go, and finally at the end she ends up going back to her mother, and I think it's very emblematic of the situation of Korea at the time, being torn between these two ideologies, not really knowing which direction to go. And then after that, the soldiers of both sides start to engage in conversation. So they were shooting at each other a few minutes before, and then they get a bit of dialogue there, and it ends up with some kind of singing contest with their own patriotic or ideological songs, and it's a really brilliant scene which I think shows the Korean conflict and the Korean trauma in a nutshell, with a lot of skills. So as you can see, I'm very enthusiastic about this film. I think it's one of the masterpieces of South Korean cinema, not North Korean cinema. So very, very recommended film for Han Sung-ki, but just because it's a great film by itself. And another film which is easy to watch, except for its length, almost 3 hours, but it's really worth, because the film is available on the South Korean Film Archive on YouTube. So big recommendation for North Korean partisans in South Korea. We will stick with Jong Ji-young, and we will move to the year 1992. It doesn't mean that Han Sung-ki didn't do anything between 1990 and 1992. He actually did, but as I already explained in the first part of the retrospective, there are many films that he did which are pretty hard to get, and so I wasn't able to watch all the film he has done during that time. So I have no choice but to skip a few of them and move to the one I've seen. That's unfortunate, but no other choice there. So I have to move directly to year 1992 with a film called White Badge, which is another war variation, let's put it this way, by Jong Ji-young. So he had talked about the Korean War with North partisans in South Korea. With White Badge, he's talking about the South Korean involvement in the Vietnam War. It's another thing which may not be very known for audience outside of South Korea, but South Korea was involved in the Vietnam War. And actually, North Korea was also involved in the Vietnam War. They did provide a few help to the North Vietnamese. But funnily enough, while the North Korean help was quite disinterested, I mean, there was the idea of having more prestige in their own communist camp, but at the same time there was also a solidarity feeling between with this state, which also had been divided because of the Cold War, like Korea, and so that was mostly disinterested for the North Korean side to help the North Vietnamese side. Not so much when it comes to South Korea. South Korea actually went into the Vietnamese War on the conditions to get a lot of advantages, a lot of help from the US. They could see that the US was very demanding to have some other countries coming into the conflict to their help, so that they could show that there was some kind of united front there, and it was not just them going into the country unilaterally. And so they were really eager to have South Korea, coming into Vietnam. And Park Chung-hee was very aware of it, and he really got the most of it. He got a lot of financial help, he got a lot of advantage, a lot of leeway also when it comes to his repressive policies in his country. And so he really milked the situation to the most. And so he sent a few divisions in South Vietnam. At first they were mostly doing supporting parts, training, building, security work, but with the years passing, they got some division, they got some member of the army taking part in direct conflict with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. And so that's something which is at the heart of White Badge. Ahn Sung-ki is playing a veteran of this South Korean army who has been involved in Vietnam. The film takes place at the very end of the 70s, just following the assassination of Park Chung-hee, and he's commissioned, he's a writer, and he's commissioned by a newspaper editor to write something about the involvement of South Korea in the Vietnam War. And so that brings a lot of memories and trauma. The film is told in this time period of the end of the 70s, but so we have a lot of flashbacks throughout the films, showing what it was in Vietnam at the time. And in order to get a bit more information and perspective on the conflict, he's going also to reunite with another of his former soldier in South Vietnam, a guy who is even more traumatized by the conflict than him, who has suicidal tendencies, and so they are going to remember this time of their life together. Compared to North Korean partisans in South Korea, I think White Badge is slightly less efficient, slightly less successful in its ambitions. But it doesn't mean that it's a bad film at all. On the contrary, it's actually a pretty good film, which is really worth a look. The main problem it has, in my opinion, actually it has two problems, but they are minor ones. The first one is that, of course, being a film about the Vietnam War, it's immediately in competition with many great films. We think about the Deer Hunter, Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, the Deer Hunter, which is actually referenced directly by Jung Ji-young in the film. And so it's hard to escape from the shadow of this very powerful Hollywood film. So that's a slight problem. It doesn't mean that the movie is badly done when it comes to its Vietnam scene. On the contrary, it's very efficient, it's really convincing, but it has a little bit of taste of already seen in a way. And the second thing which limits to some extent the artistic success of White Badge, in my opinion, is that it's slightly confusing about what it wants to say. Jung Ji-young tries to make some parallel with the situation in during the Korean War, and I think on that front he's pretty successful. We see, for example, a flashback of Ahn Sung-ki remember his childhood and how the American soldiers were treating him when he was a child, struggling to survive. And then we see that the South Korean soldiers are doing the same to Vietnamese child when they are in Vietnam. So that's an interesting parallel there of the victim doing the same thing once they are in the same position. So this part is okay, but at the same time is trying to draw a parallel with the situation of the military dictatorship in Korea. We see that there is some protest against Chanduan, which are repressed with a lot of violence. And so once again we have a parallel with the situation in Vietnam. And here it's I think it's slightly more confused about what it really wants to say, but at least it's interesting because he tries to say something about the situation on how it was in South Korea at the time, and it's a good thing he does, because if he just did a film only focused on the Vietnam part, I mean, it would have been more generic and it would have less personality. So it's both a success in a way because it's able to incorporate the point of view of South Korea, the specific point of view of South Korea, but at the same time it's a little bit confused about what it wants to say about South Korea at the time, on what is exactly the parallel with Vietnam. But still, it's certainly food for thought, and it's certainly worth having a look at. Hwang Jin Yi, by the way, is a director who is one of the exception of this director of this generation, this director from the 80s and 90s, as we have seen with Jung Woo-sun or Bae Chung-ho. Those directors who were successful around that time, they didn't really manage to transition to the 2000s when you had a new generation of directors. And Hwang Jin Yi is actually one of the very few who manage. He is still active nowadays. I think the last film he did was from 2019. So he's still there, he's still relevant, and it's a good thing because, as we saw already around that time, during the 90s, he was doing a film with a lot of artistic ambition, and he was, for the most part, successful at it. So a very good combo there to go through the North Korean Partisans in South Korea, and then White Badge. Both good films, a little preference, as I said, for the first one. They are both worth a view nonetheless. In 1993, we have To the Starry Island, a film directed by Park Kwang-soo, so the director of Chilsu and Mansu, based on a script by Lee Chan-dong, so another very famous director who back then was still mostly a script writer. To the Starry Island, in a way, is a variation on the same topic as the North Korean Partisans in the South Korea. The film is set in in a contemporary time, and we have two characters: a son who brings his father to his birth village so that he can be buried there, and he is accompanied by a good friend of him. The good friend of him being played by Han Sung-ki. And when they reach the village, the villagers actually refuse for the father to be buried there. And then through some flashbacks we will understand why they refuse for him to be in Earth here. And of course it's linked to what happened during the Korean War. The concept of the film is pretty good, I think. But the execution is a bit lacking, in my opinion. The main problem is that there are a lot of secondary storyline about what it was, the life in the village, with many different characters who are not really linked directly to the main drama, and who I think are a bit distracting, and they don't really help to focus clearly on the most interesting aspect of the story, and so that makes it a bit disjointed in a way, and that's pretty unfortunate. And then when it comes to the main drama, when we realized that the village had suffered a lot during the time of the Korean War, the film is not bad, but it suffers once again from the comparison with the other films on the same subject which had been done, namely North Korean Partisans in South Korea, but also another film which I'm going to talk about just after, which in my opinion is much better when it comes to this depiction of this very difficult situation. The film To the Starry Island still has some good dramatic moments, but there are just too few, in my opinion, to be completely convincing. There is also some kind of, I'm not sure if I can call it a twist, but some kind of revelation about who is in charge in the village at some point. And I don't know if it's based on a real story. Of course, if it's based on a real story, then there is nothing I can say. If it really happened, then fair enough. But when I saw it, I thought it was a bit like emotional blackmail in a sense, and I didn't really appreciate it. I thought that was a bit heavy-handed in order to generate some surprise and emotions. But as I said, maybe it really happened, and in this case, it could be justified. But I just didn't really like it when I saw the film itself. Ahn Sung-ki himself is actually he has a double part. He's playing the Ahn Sung-ki in modern time and Ahn Sung-ki of the past. His father, his own father, during the time of the Korean War in the village, and he's more like a passive witness to the events, a bit like the character from Dr. Zhivago in a way. He's okay. He's doing well, but he's a bit in the background, so it's not really the film really doesn't rely that much on him when it comes to the most dramatic passage. So fine performance, but not that much to talk about there. And so I moved to the other film on the same subject, which in my opinion is much better than the Starry Island, which was made in 1994 by Im Kwon-taek, and it's called the Taebaek Mountains. If you are already familiar from the channel, you know that I'm a big fan of Im Kwon-taek, that I consider him to be the very best South Korean director, so no surprise that I think that this film is a major film and better than To the Starry Island. I already talked about Im Kwon-taek when it came to video like my favorite Korean film, and I didn't include Taebaek Mountains. I chose to have Seopyeonji instead, and I do think that Seopyeonji is like the ultimate masterpiece of Im Kwon-taek, but Taebaek Mountains is still a very, very good film, which could easily be in my top 5 Im Kwon-taek film. It's actually an adaptation of a series of 10 books, which is almost like a Korean war and peace in a way. It follows many different characters from a village during the time a bit before the Korean War, and the different trajectories that all these characters will have during those troubled times. Originally, Im Kwon-taek wanted to adapt those books into a two-part films, but there was a huge backlash, a lot of criticism about him adapting these books, and at the end he had to compress and do only one film out of those 10 books instead of the 2 films that he had originally in mind. And because of that, Im Kwon-taek himself is not really satisfied by the film. Having not read the books, I cannot really compare, and maybe indeed the film is below the books, I cannot say. But from my own point of view, just having watched the film, I still think it's a brilliant film. So we follow, like the book, a little village in the very south west of South Korea, a bit before the Korean War, around 1948. And around that time, there were already some North Korean partisans in action around that area, and so the village will be under the domination of these different factions at different times. It will start with the North Korean partisans, then the South Korean government. And what you will see is that basically, even if those two sides have a very different ideology, they have actually very similar way to deal with the people on their opponents. You will see a lot of abuse, a lot of difficult situations which the everyday people have to face during those troubled times. Ahn Sung-ki is playing a teacher from a fairly bourgeois background, but is someone who has humanity, who doesn't have a very strong stance on one or the other side. You can see he's maybe a bit more slightly left-oriented, but not that much. He basically wants to remain human and not lose his own humanity, and try to have things done correctly. But of course, during those times where the extremes are ruling, different kind of extreme, it's extremely hard. And it's especially interesting to see a film being made, to see such a film being made by Im Kwon-taek, because it's a subject which he knew very dearly, because his father was from this kind of bourgeois background, and he had joined the partisans, the communist partisans, and he had been involved in this militia against the South Korean government, and that's why partially Im Kwon-taek was very cautious when he was a filmmaker not to go against the government because of this family background. And you have another character in Taebaek Mountains who is exactly like his father, and so you can see that he has put a lot of himself in the film, and he has put a lot of heart, and it really shows when it comes to the emotion and the drama that are on display in the film. The technical side is also very satisfying. The reconstitution is well done. It has all the trademark of Im Kwon-taek when it comes to direction, with this kind of long takes, tracking shots with the characters in the landscape, these kind of things which are really his directorial trademark. Strong performance from all the actors. It's really a very, very good film. As I said, in my opinion, one of his very best, even if he's himself critical about it. So yeah, this Taebaek Mountain, great exploration of the psychology of people when they are under this kind of extreme conditions, which in a way we can see also recently in events like the Ukraine-Russian war. So a big recommendation once again in my book, another major film in the filmography of Ahn Sung-ki, and another film easy to catch because it is on the Korean Film Archives YouTube channel. So you can really have the perfect combo in a way when it comes to what happened in the south of South Korea a bit around the time of the Korean War, with the Taebaek Mountain and North Korean partisans in South Korea. Great combo, two very good films and two very good performances by Ahn Sung-ki. I moved to 1996 with a film by Kohei Oguri called Sleeping Man. As you can see from the name of the director, it's actually a Japanese film. A Japanese film in which Ahn Sung-ki is somebody who had an accident and who is in a coma. It happens in a small village city of Japan, and is basically taken care. And we will follow different characters whose life gravitates more or less clearly around this character in coma. In a way, Sleeping Man is the typical cliche Japanese films, meaning that it is a film which has a very slow rhythm, many very long takes, and it's a bit unclear about what it wants to say. Actually, I think in the first third of the film, the film is actually pretty interesting. It managed to recreate the atmosphere of this village, semi-urban, semi-village life with in Japan with a lot of care, and it's intriguing. You meet a lot of different characters in their everyday life, and you find it interesting at first, and you are curious about where it's going to lead. Unfortunately, the more it goes on, the less it leads to anything. And I think that's the big problem of the film, is that it doesn't really have much to say, or if it has something to say, it didn't come to me. I wasn't really able to get the idea that the director wanted to express and wanted to transmit to me. So the more I watched it, and the less I was interested, which is pretty unfortunate. But for Ahn Sung-ki himself, it's interesting because that's the very first film which he did outside of Korea. It shows that he was starting to have a bit of international recognition, and that's something which will have an impact on his career with more international productions, or at least co-productions. It shows that he was able to make an impression on filmmakers all over the world around that time, and that's an interesting thing. For him, it was certainly an easy job because he is really the sleeping man, so he's just sleeping in a bed during the whole film, except at the very end where we see him in a forest where he's standing and walking and have 1 or 2 lines of dialogues, if I remember correctly. But that's the only active thing he does. The rest of the time he's just lying down, and that's it. So very easy job, very easy money to make for Ahn Sung-ki. So I can perfectly understand that he was very eager to make it. But as far as I'm concerned, I would not really recommend it. I don't think it's a very good film, either from Ahn Sung-ki's point of view or either from the Japanese cinema point of view. There are much more interesting film from Japan than this Sleeping Man. Let's get back with Im Kwon-taek, Ahn Sung-ki being one of the favorite actor of the director, with a movie made in 1997 called Festival, a movie I already mentioned a little bit in the very first video I did for the channel about Im Kwon-taek, about this very famous South Korean director. On a Festival sees Ahn Sung-ki playing once again a writer. That's something he plays quite often. A writer whose mother is dying, actually has just died, and he has to go back to his village in order to take care of the funeral for his mother. And those funerals are the traditional Korean ones, which can be quite long. I don't remember exactly if it's like 3 or 7 days. Anyway, it takes quite a long time. It's a big organization with everybody from the family coming there, with the friends, and so you have a lot of things to take care of. And during that time where everybody is gathering, all the skeletons in the closet of the family are finally going to appear, and that will create a lot of dramatic situations, obviously. Many qualities in this film which when you just hear about the story, it feels a bit like those French author film where it's a family drama in a kitchen. There is a bit of this vibe, but it's not a problem here. It still makes for a very strong offering, because there is this empathy from Im Kwon-taek for his character. He really has an interest into all of them. He never really judged them, and he just shows them for what they are in all their complexity, and that's something you can relate, and that's something which makes for a very strong dramatic impact, and it will touch you also, even if you are not directly concerned by those events. And he has also a capacity to get the best of his actors, which play for the movie, for the best of the film here. He is also able to show some cultural aspect of Korea which are interesting if you are not that familiar with them. Yeah, in this case it's this kind of traditional funerals. It's almost ethnographic in a way, and it's actually very interesting to look at. He also gives a very convincing rendering of what is the life in this kind of small village in South Korea. As usual, you have his brilliant use of long take. He is at the best of his abilities there, and is able to really show all the characters in an interesting light and to create a very engaging drama. So just maybe it's not the very best Im Kwon-taek film, but it's still a very strong offering there, with good performance from all the actors, Ahn Sung-ki included. Of course, he's at ease in this kind of parts. I mean, he has already done this kind of writer, witness of events kind of thing, so he has absolutely no problem. Very good performance as expected for a movie which is a bit low-key, but which has a lot of interesting things to offer. Let's go to 1998 with Art Museum by the Zoo, a film by Lee Jong-young. We are starting to get into the world of the Korean new wave there, when South Korean cinema became famous on the world map of cinema through directors like Bong Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, all these kind of things. You already probably know about it, but this tendency already started at the very end of the 90s, and a few films started to show that there was something happening in South Korea, and Art Museum by the Zoo was one of them. He had a little buzz about it when it was released in 1998. It's a romantic comedy with a guy doing his military service, who has a few days outside of the military service, the few days of holidays, and he's going to meet his girlfriend, but when he comes to her apartment, he realized that she has gone. She actually has broken up with him, and there is another girl in this apartment, and as he has nowhere to stay, he stays with her. And this girl is a filmmaker wannabe, and she's working on a script which is a love story, and this guy is going to help her with this script, and that will be a way for the two characters to exchange their vision of love. The concept is actually pretty smart. The idea of having these characters express their feelings through the script, and the script allowing a lot of possibilities creatively. I should explain a bit more. So actually the filmmaker is interested in a parliamentary assistant who is played by Ahn Sung-ki. She has a crush for him, but she's unable to express her feelings to him, and so she put them in the script. And when we see the script being played, it is played with this character played by Ahn Sung-ki, and the female character is actually the girlfriend of the other guy, and so it's really a way for them to be able to express indirectly their own feelings. And so you have several times where we see how this script plays out with both actors playing the scenes. And so this concept is very interesting because it opens the door to a lot of creativity, and it can be very funny, and you can see them doing things and then redo it another way after they have exchanged. So there is a lot of possibility to have something very dynamic, very creative, and both funny and touching at the same time. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what the director does there. He actually doesn't spend that much time on the script aspects, in my opinion, and it's more like a typical romantic comedy with the two main characters who don't like each other at first, who have a few funny interactions there and there, and of course they start to develop feelings for each other, and it's fairly well done. You have enough affection for the characters, and you have no problem following the story there, but it makes for the script aspect of the story fairly secondary, and I think that's a shame because I thought that was where there was the most potential to have something extremely interesting and extremely clever, but that's not really what happens here. And so while Art Museum by the Zoo is a perfectly decent romantic comedy, if you like this kind of genre, you can certainly check it. I do have a bit of disappointment and a slight frustration that the director didn't go further on the script aspect. So I have it's a very small disappointment as far as I'm concerned, and given the good reputation that the film has. It's also a bit surprising to have Ahn Sung-ki being the crush of the filmmaker wannabe here, because when he did the film he was already in his, I think, early 40s, something like that, and the female character is supposed to be in her mid-20s. I thought it was a bit wide age difference. It's not a big problem. I mean, you can certainly have age difference in couples, so why not? But it doesn't feel that natural here. Of course, Ahn Sung-ki is a charming individual, and I really like him, and I could certainly fall in love with him, but still it doesn't feel completely right there, in my opinion. But it's not really a big problem by itself. He does an okay job, but as I said, given that he's playing this fantasized character, I thought there would be more room for him to do things, and at the end he's not given that much room when he plays these characters. So he does a perfectly fine job. There is really no problem with his performance, but once again I expected more from the concept of the film. So mixed result as far as I'm concerned with Art Museum by the Zoo. If you are a fan of Korean romantic comedy, though, that's certainly worth a look, because it's another evolution in what would become this very successful recipe from the South Korean cinema with the early 2000s with films like My Sassy Girl. With the year 1999, we are back with Lee Myung-se, the director of the awful Gagman. But with this one, it's a much better result. It's a film called Nowhere to Hide, in which Ahn Sung-ki is a killer. He's a killer who is chased by two cops. And one of the cops, and the main one being shown in the film, is actually played by the same actor as Chilsu and Mansu, playing Chilsu in the film of 1988. It's a duo which was actually quite successful in Chilsu and Mansu, but they also did another film together around 93, 94, which was called Two Cups. It was a commercial success. So this pairing of these two actors had a real commercial value there. So it's no surprise that we find them working together again in this 1999 film. The story of Nowhere to Hide is pretty basic, but what makes the film extremely interesting is the direction by Lee Myung-se. I guess he must have been aware that the story itself was nothing to brag about, and he took the decision to make it the most interesting possible by choosing to be extremely experimental when it comes to the direction, when it comes to the editing. So he used a lot of different cinematographic tricks, from the freeze frames, from the way he fades from one scene to another, from the choice of framing. You have, for example, a chase scene at some point where he just keeps the camera straight, no move, nothing, just the camera there, and there are different levels, and you see the characters going from one to the other. It's almost like a Tex Avery cartoon in a way, and there are a lot of this kind of interesting directorial ideas. You can see that he has put a lot of attention, a lot of care in trying to make it interesting, even if the story itself is fairly generic, and it works. It really works, and it makes for a very exciting film to watch. You are always wondering what will come up in the next scene, what will be the next idea that he will have in order to make it interesting, and so that's very successful on that front. In a way, you could argue that Nowhere to Hide is in a similar way as films like Our Sweet Days of Youth or Art Museum by the Zoo, where the prototype of the romantic comedy Korean style, Nowhere to Hide is a bit the prototype of the cops and gangster stories, which would have such a specific Korean vibe during the 2000s, and it's already kind of there on display, starting to appear with Nowhere to Hide, with this a bit dark atmosphere. The main cop character, so the one played by the actor playing Chilsu, is also extremely reminiscent of the character Song Kang-ho plays in Memories of Murders. So there is really a trendsetter aspect in this Nowhere to Hide, and it's a film which is fascinating to watch from the beginning to the end. Lee Myung-se has really been able to to put the disaster that was Gagman behind him, and do something extremely interesting there with Nowhere to Hide. Ahn Sung-ki actually is almost a supporting part. He doesn't appear that often, mostly in the last third of the film. He doesn't have many dialogues either. He's more like a physical presence, but he does a very good job. He really brings this aura of danger when he is on the screen. He's also quite physical. He has a lot of running, fighting to do, which can be a bit surprising. I mean, Ahn Sung-ki is not necessarily the most physical actor. He's more of a dramatic actor, but he does a good job. There is really no problem in his performance here. He is convincing from the beginning to the end for a film which is certainly worth a look. This Nowhere to Hide, extremely interesting prototype of Korean cops and gangster films. I moved to the year 2001 with Musa, also called The Warrior, directed by Kim Sung-soo, an ambitious co-production between China and South Korea, which at the time of its release was the most expensive South Korean film. We are a bit in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragons exploitation territory there, with a group of Korean warriors and diplomats who are sent to get some diplomatic links with the Ming Dynasty in China. Unfortunately, they are arrested, they are sent to some kind of camp, manage to escape, meet some Mongols who have kidnapped a Ming princess, and they decide to take the princess back and bring her to the emperor of the Ming dynasty in order to finally fulfill their mission. And that's this part which we will mostly be concerned about, them trying to bring this princess to the emperor of China while being attacked by the Mongols. So there is a bit of a vibe from the middle of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, when Zhang Ziyi is also with a group of bandits, and she falls in love, and so there is a similar storyline, similar vibe there. There is also a bit of influence from the wuxia pian from China during the 80s and the 90s, which is a bit more surprising, but certainly interesting and certainly successful in creating an interesting atmosphere. What I mean by that is that you probably already know, if you have seen the video I did about the martial art films from mainland China. So during the 80s, 90s, they tended to do wuxia stories which were a bit rough in the aesthetic, often in desert, either deserted land, and films like Swordsman in Double Flag Town or Yellow River Fighter. So a bit dark atmosphere, and there is the same vibe here. When it comes to the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon legacy, it's of course reinforced by the fact that we have Zhang Ziyi here playing the Chinese princess, so the link with the Ang Lee film is quite obvious. Musa is a film which has mixed reviews usually. People can be quite critical of it, but as far as I'm concerned, I really like it actually. I think as I said, the atmosphere, this desertic atmosphere, a bit a la Lawrence of Arabia, a bit David Lean, mix of David Lean on the crude wuxia pian of mainland of the 80s, 90s is extremely successful in my opinion. The money is really on the screen when it comes to the costumes, when it comes to the sets. It's very believable, it's beautiful to look at, the cinematography is magnificent. You have a pretty strong casting, of course, with Zhang Ziyi, but also with another Chinese actor who I really like, with Yuhong Wang, the former star of the Forgotten Mirage, which I already talked about in another video as well, so go check it out. It's always a pleasure to see him, in this case playing the leader of the Mongols. You have Han Sung-ki, of course, who is an elite bowman, leading also a small group of fighters in this team of Korean army and diplomats. You have Jung Woo-sung also is there, so strong casting, pretty solid direction. The director actually is a big fan of Chang Che, the very famous wuxia kung fu film director from Shaw Brothers during the end of the 60s, 70s. It's not that obvious, to be honest, when you watch the film. Maybe yeah, in some of the violence displayed during the fight, but otherwise it's not a movie which is too much Chang Che influence. It's less about brotherhood and friendship and more about the feelings, the romantic feelings with the princess and the character of the slave, the freed slave, played by Jung Woo-sung. The film is also interesting for the fact that it is a co-production between China and Korea, something which was a small trend back in the days. Seven Swords, if you remember, was also such a co-production. I personally appreciate what they were trying to do to create this kind of dynamics between these different countries, and I wish it had been successful. Now in hindsight, it looks like it was just a small trend which didn't really last, but I wish they could have been able to continue in this direction. The film is very entertaining, a lot of action also, of course, but it has some political meaning as well. I think the fact that you are dealing with characters who are trying to create diplomatic relation with China is not innocent. Being a co-production with China, it's really emblematic of an attempt to have better relations between Korea and China at the time, which was to some extent successful, with Korea becoming quite influential in the Chinese pop culture, in trade as well, and which didn't necessarily last following the anti-missile debate during the year 2016, I think, around that time. I may be not that accurate when it comes to the year of the THAAD missile system. But it's anyway interesting on that aspect. And you also have a bit of a political commentary about the state of Korea itself, because the different people in the Korean delegation are really based on their own region, and so they have to unite in order to be able to face their opponents. And I think that's a commentary on the politics of South Korea, which is very factionalized between different regions, and it's a real problem they have to be able to overcome this kind of regional loyalty. And I think that the movie wants to say something about that. Maybe I'm digging a bit too far, but I'm wondering if it may be also a commentary about the situation of South and North Korea. Not too sure there. Maybe I'm going a bit too far, but at least there are some political commentary, political ideas there. It's not just a movie only for the entertainment. Well, there is nothing wrong about it. But it delivers a bit more than that, and I think that's to its credit. And so at the end, I really enjoy Musa. Maybe it's a little bit too long for its own good, especially when you watch the original Korean cut, because there is an international cut which removed like 40 minutes. But still, in any case, in any version you watch it, I think it's a good, epic, a swordsman kind of film, and it's certainly worth a look. A different kind of film with 2002 Marry Iyagi by Lee Song-gang, as it is an animation film. Marry Iyagi follows some schoolboys in a small coastal village of South Korea, and they have to deal with friendship. They have to deal with some trauma. In this case, the main character, the main boy, has to deal with the consequence of the death of his father, accidental death of his father, and in order to manage to deal with this different aspect of their life, he will go into some kind of dream-like world where he is able to heal better and to move forward in his life. When I watched Marry Iyagi, I felt there was a bit of Totoro vibe in this description of life in the countryside, and in this mix of fantasy world with some more contemporary issues, but it's really the low quality version of Totoro. And I'm sorry to say that, because the film certainly has art, and it has good intentions, but it just has a lot of difficulty to deliver as much as it wants. It's actually a short film, less than 90 minutes, but even like that, it feels very slow. The pace is not well handled. It doesn't move as swiftly as it should, and we have difficulty to relate to the main characters. There are one or two scenes which manage to deliver, which you really feel for the characters, but they are really just too scattered, not enough in order to create the empathy which would be successful for the film. And so at the end it's a bit vain and slightly frustrating, because you would want it to be successful at what it tries to do, but no, you can't really say that it achieved the objective that it had. The character design I was not super fond of either. It has its own visual identity, and so that's to the benefit of the film. It doesn't try to ape Hollywood or Japan, so that's a good thing. But you can still feel that the technical abilities of the South Korean industry on this production, especially, was not to the international standards yet. It was going there. It was a right step in the direction, but it's still a bit lacking. The animation being a bit not as smooth as you would like it. As I said, the character design was not completely convincing as far as I'm concerned, at least. Maybe you will find it more interesting than me. And so, once again, even if the film has a lot of heart and you want it to succeed, the result is mostly frustrating. Ahn Sung-ki is just a voice, obviously. He's doing the voice of the friend of the mother of the main character, who is probably his future stepfather. It's not clearly stated, but we can see it's going in this direction. Good job there, but nothing much to say for a film which is mostly, unfortunately, disappointing. Last in contact film of this second part of this Ahn Sung-ki retrospective, it's Painted Fire, which she did in 2002, and which is an adaptation of the life of a famous painter called Jung Sung-hob. I probably have mispronounced it. Anyway, famous painter from the Joseon dynasty, so the last dynasty of Korea. He lived during the end of the dynasty, if I remember correctly, so end of the 19th century. Famous for his eccentricities, and so it makes for a colorful character to have a biopic of. He's played here by Choi Min-sik, who had become famous thanks to his very strong performance in Old Boy. And here is half convincing, half over the top, in my opinion. In a way, it fits the character because, as I said, he was quite an eccentric painter, as far as I know. So it's normal that he does a bit over the top sometimes, but he pushed it maybe a little bit further than what I would have, what I would think would be fitting for the characters. Still, a pretty good performance for Choi Min-sik. Ahn Sung-ki is playing a noble guy who is some kind of mentor, who is ready to help the painter in order to develop his skills, and who is fairly progressive also regarding the evolution of society and the evolution of painting as well. So a very positive character there. It's kind of funny to see Ahn Sung-ki being in a period film, dressed with the old style of costume, with the beard and stuff, because that's not something which is that usual with him. As you can see from this retrospective and the first part, he did mostly contemporary drama, So it's a bit funny to see in there, but no problem with his performance. He delivers as expected. The film itself is a good description of what is the life of an artist, how you have to do compromise, or how you try not to do compromise in order to be true to your artistic vision, the difficulty of remaining an artist with a society which is evolving. So subjects which Im Kwon-taek already touched upon in a film like Sopyeonji, or another film which is less known, which title escaped me right now, but which was made in 1991 by Im Kwon-taek, and which is another biopic of a famous semi-religious, semi-philosophical figure during the same time in Korea. There is really a parallel between those two characters, in my opinion. But as far as I'm concerned, I prefer the 1991 film. But this one is still a pretty strong offering from Im Kwon-taek, and it deals with the right subject, it deals with the right interrogation that an artist would have to face during this kind of times. So, as usual, also beautiful direction and artistic direction, but that's a given with Im Kwon-taek. So, very solid film. Once again, you can never really go wrong with Im Kwon-taek during that time. So don't hesitate to check A Painted Fire. The same year, Han Sung-ki really reached the pinnacle of his career. He has really made it. He became the president of South Korea in The Romantic President, directed by Jong Man-bae. A romantic president, it's very clear, he is the president of South Korea, and he is going to fall in love with the teacher of his daughter. It's unclear if he is a widower or a divorcee, but anyway, he is single, he's available, and he's going to get into a relationship with this pretty teacher. And with The Romantic President, we enter into the purely idealized fairy tale. I mean, there is nothing realistic in this film at all. It makes no sense from the beginning to the end. There are a lot of things which are completely illogical. I mean, in this case, you have the daughter of the president who is within a high school, a basic high school. That seems very unexpected. You have the teacher who is completely unaware that she has the daughter of the president in her class. Once again, it seems very hard to believe. You have the president who ends up doing the homework or the punishment given by the teacher himself, copying things like he has nothing better to do. It's really very hard to believe this story. It's the most idealized version of romantic comedy you can imagine. So you have to accept that, basically, otherwise you just have to stop after 10 minutes. Is it successful? To some extent, because there is a good duo between Han Sung-ki and his female partner who is actually the girl in Nowhere to Hide. The girl who was playing his girlfriend, but in Nowhere to Hide we never really saw them together because she was under the protection of the police. But so finally here with The Romantic President, the two actors are really able to fulfill their romantic story. It's as cliche as you expect. You have the classic structure with one or two obstacles which are sent in the story, in their romance, and once again those obstacles are quite artificial. I mean, it's really just in order to make it more difficult for them to be together. The first one especially. The second one deals with his political career, so it's a little bit more realistic there, especially as during the rest of the film the political aspect was completely out of the window. But even like this, that remains very superficial and very fairy tale oriented. I can't say I found it good. It's just too unrealistic to my taste. But Ahn Sung-ki has a lot of charm in this perfect president, and it's really the most perfect president you can ever imagine. He's honest, he's good at communicating. I mean, he has only qualities. But what I find more interesting in a way is the fact that a film like this was even produced. And I think that there is two reasons behind it. First, because there was a similar thing happening in Hollywood. If I remember correctly, around that time there were a few films which had been produced with a president having romantic stories. I think there is one with Michael Douglas. I'm not completely sure, but I remember there were things like this happening also in the US, and Korean cinema is also very aware of the trend in the US, so that probably gave them some inspiration there. And at the same time, you have to realize that when the film was produced, the president in South Korea was Kim Dae-jung. Kim Dae-jung, who had been the main opposite of the Park Chung-hee regime of military dictatorship in South Korea in general, and who finally got elected in 1998, I think. And his election was the proof, the confirmation that democracy was finally there in South Korea, and he was a very popular president, of course, because of his history, but also because he managed to put a more social agenda while keeping the economy strong. So he was really appreciated as a president, and so that probably made a film like this possible, to have a president being shown under such a positive light, because there was Kim Dae-jung, who was indeed quite appreciated. As far as I'm concerned, as I say, I don't think it's really a good film. But if you really like Ahn Sung-ki, he is indeed very charming there. So that can be a good reason for you to watch. Or if you are a hardcore romantic comedy fan, you can have a look. You may find some satisfaction there. In 2003, Ahn Sung-ki was in Silmido, directed by Kang Woo-suk. Silmido was a very big success in South Korea in 2003. It's actually based on a real story. So during the end of the 60s, if I remember correctly, tension between South Korea and North Korea were very high, and Kim Il-sung sent a commando of North Koreans to kill Park Chung-hee. Those people, those North Koreans, managed to reach the Blue House, so the presidential palace in South Korea. They were killed before being able to enter, but so they came pretty close to reach their objective. And quite understandably, Park Chung-hee was furious about that, and he decided to have his revenge, and he then assembled his own commando group with the idea of sending them to North Korea in order to kill Kim Il-sung. But then later on he changed his mind, and so those people were never sent to South Korea, and they were basically in limbo, and they tried to just escape from their training center, and they were killed in the process. So a very dramatic story, something which if you were seeing it in a film, you would think, oh, it's unbelievable. I mean, that would never happen in real, but it's actually a real story, and that's what Silmido does. It adapts to the screen this real story. So it's a film which is very macho oriented. We have a lot of boys. We have this brotherhood aspect, a lot of training, hardcore training here. There is also a bit of a Dirty Dozen vibe, because all these commando from South Korea are actually people who were supposed to be executed, to have the death penalty. So they really have nothing to lose there. But the film is very successful in create some empathy for them. You really feel for them, seeing what they have to get through this crazy training, and then to see that they are really being manipulated by the government and used as just pawn in a political game which is much bigger than them, and their life has basically no worth. So it's quite touching in a way, and you root for them, and it's very dramatic when the logical conclusion finally happen. So a real good film, I must say. Surprisingly, you could expect it to be very commercial, and it is commercial in a way, but it's also touching, and the fact that it is based on this real story gives it a real ground on which it can build emotion, on which it can develop its story. It's really well done, well performed by all the actors. Ahn Sung-ki here is playing the head of this detachment, I mean, in charge of their training. He's already in this strict military style, and he does it very well. But you also see that at some point he starts to develop a bit of affection for the people that he has under his care, even if he has to be still a very tough, almost cruel commander. And so he has a good composition. He has a good character, a character with more layers than it may look at the first glance, and he does it with a lot of guts. So it's good performance, good film, real recommendation with Silmido. It was a big success in South Korea for good reasons, because it is indeed a good film. And we will finish with retrospective with a movie made in 2004. It's Arahan, directed by Ryu Seung-wan. Ryu Seung-wan, who is the specialist of action, entertaining South Korean blockbuster. He recently directed the pretty good Escape from Mogadishu. And Arahan is actually his first blockbuster in this kind of genre, this kind of very action, comedy, entertaining blockbuster style. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. He can do some pretty good film, as I said, Escape from Mogadishu, but I think it tends to be a bit heavy in his direction, in the different topics it's dealing with. And here I'm thinking, for example, of Battleship Island, which I found overly nationalistic. So I'm not necessarily that convinced with Ryu Seung-wan, and Arahan is certainly not a film which helped me to have a more positive opinion of him. It's a movie which is inspired by a lot of influence from all over the world. There is a bit of Shaolin Soccer, of Hong Kong martial art films, a bit of Matrix as well, and a bit of postmodern vibe, I would say, with this almost Tarantino-like in a way, in putting a lot of comedy as soon as its story is becoming a bit too serious. But it's very heavy comedy, in my opinion, which is a bit annoying, to be honest. It's not made better by the fact that the main actor is Ryo Seung-boon, who, if I'm correct, is the brother of Ryu Seung-wan, and with an actor I've never been fond of. And here I don't think he's giving a very good performance. He's really in your face during all the comedy skits. There is no subtlety there. He's a bit more convincing when it comes to action. He's actually decent when he does the action, but I'm not fond of him when he does the comedy aspect, which for the most part I didn't find funny. What is the story actually? There is not much. He's playing Ryu Sung-boon is playing a small cop who actually has a great potential to become a very powerful martial art master, a martial art master who is destined by his fate to protect a key who in bad hands could lead to the destruction, the chaos in the world, and of course some kind of old martial art master from the old time is going to appear, and he will have to fight him in order to prevent this guy to take possession of the key. And as I said, this very basic storyline is just an excuse to have a lot of comedy because the guy is unable to really be serious in his training during the first half of the film, so that creates a lot of comedy situation, which, as I said, were not that funny in my opinion. And then during the second part of the film, that becomes a bit more serious, and it's more action oriented with slightly better result. There is actually a pretty good Jackie Chan influence scene in a restaurant, a fight scene in a restaurant, which has a okay choreography and which is handled decently when it comes to the editing and the direction. The final is also okay in a more Ching Tung over the top style, but it's decent at the very least, and that makes for a barely watchable film, I would say. But it still has a lot of this vibe of the early 2000s, which was at play in all Asia, in South Korea, in Japan, in Hong Kong, with films which were very youth oriented, but youth as imagined by the producers, meaning with a lot of idols, models, who for the most part are not able to act very well, with an emphasis on special effects, digital special effects especially, a technological aspect, and a lot of low-brow comedy. And so this combo was extremely prevalent in Asia during the early 2000s, and it led to the production of many very bad films. And Arahan is part of this trend. Not the worst in my opinion, but none of these films created during this trend were really satisfying, and so this one is no exception. It's basic at best, bordering the bad, so not a film very satisfying in my opinion. Ahn Sung-ki is playing a martial art master, the main martial art master who is training Ryu Sung-boon's character. He's basically bringing a bit more seriousness into the story. He's the only one who is not putting comedy there, even if you can see that he's not he's aware in what kind of film he is, and he has a little smile sometimes where you can see that he knows it's not going to be a very serious film, and he's just there in order to do the exposition or the background story, and that's pretty much it. So he's doing okay, but of course he's a supporting part, and it's not for him that you should watch the film. A film with very mixed result, as I said, bordering the bad, but with the right kind of mood, maybe you will find it entertaining. But anyway, that's on this Arahan that we will finish this second part of the retrospective. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you will be curious about some of the films I talk about, and you will try to look at them, and I hope also, of course, that you will like them. I will see you very soon in another video, and of course with the last part, the third and last part of this Ahn Sung-ki retrospective. Until then, watch a lot of films and take care.